When in the early morning, at dawn, you rise and mount your stallion, apart from the sand and dust that rises up around you, the columns of dust. The road which you will follow is not one on which people lose their way. And indeed, it is straight from here to Hiran. Nevertheless, what the Haud is known for is hardship and lack of water. The present season is the time of the light Khalil rains. God, who fills our water ponds, will not make you thirst. Bush thick and impenetrable, scorched hagar trees, the hot air rising from them. Hot wind and heat, which will lick you like a flame. A mantle of air and a shade-giving tree will shelter you. The swelling of feet pricked by thorns, a thorny thicket, plants prickly and spiny. Charred plants, hot stumps of burned trees, the hot air rising from them. The burnt branches and tree trunks through which you will pass will not harm you. A bull, rhinoceros, ready to jump. A male lion, angry and roaring in attack. The goring with the head, the clutching of claws, the biting fang. The giraffe's rocking gait, the kicking of the leg, the elephant flying, the hyena's attack, the beasts of prey, open-mouthed, panting for meat. A leopard attacking in daylight, the fox sneaking away, a cheetah growling, a hairy hyena, a maned hyena skulking in hidden places, a pack of wolves. Creeping beasts, evil reptiles, venomous, bearing poison. The robbers who roam, the raiders, the hunters, the fugitives, the thieves. The small bustard with its piteous cry. The great bustard whose heart trembles. The heat of the rainless season, the desolate terrain, losing the way.
You know, the conservation propaganda, the way they use, or dehumanize Africans, right, as being incapable of caring for their wildlife, right? The kind of language they use to describe, and sort of instill that sense of urgency, right, for donors to give money to these conservation agencies. Like, they simplify the narrative, but they also really are humanizing Africans, right, and demonizing African men, this African man who's about to go and kill all your elephant, your precious elephant, right? And so what they're doing with that kind of narrative is taking it to the Senate floor or, policymakers, so that the US government can basically give more funding towards militaristic, equipment, to further militarize the commons or militarize these national parks, these like game refuge, these wildlife refuge, to protect the refuge of wildlife against Africans, basically, right? If you look at the war on poaching, the rhetoric that they're using, it's so violent, okay? I mean, they're using words like African chainsaw massacre, for example, using images of like this poached elephant, and right by it, you have this African man sitting next to that, that poached elephant, taking photos of it, spreading it onto their like website, like, for example, the African Anti-Poaching Foundation, right? And so they're using even these militaristic images, these military images, you know, of like the foot soldier that's coming in and then saving the elephants from the African, you know, poacher. And so all of that language that they're using this, it's basically a rhetorical device, right? To not only further justify or create the sensation of like this urgent need or the urgency to enter into this war, you know, war on poaching, right? That's the term they use, war on poaching. That's so American, like so fitting of imperialist, you know, or they're even using yeah, to further militarize these landscape, right, and then keep Africans out of that. But that what's so dangerous, Sarah, is that, and absolutely disturbing, is that there's actually a lot of killing that goes on. A lot of African men especially are being killed while they're going in there, or when they're suspected to be poaching, right? They don't even necessarily, because it's a shoot to kill policy. A lot of these governments have shoot to kill policy. So you're basically, you know, shooting on the, you know, targeting to shoot. If you see an African in there that looks like, who looks like he's poaching, it doesn't matter what he's poaching. Okay, it doesn't matter what, you know, what kind of game they're poaching. Just shoot. That's what the shoot to kill policy does. And Botswana has it, and a few other, they want to expand it throughout Southern Africa, all of that under the pretext of wildlife conservation, or their poaching, war against poaching, that's like threatening, like they call it. You know, Hillary Clinton, I remember her speech talking about how the war on poaching is like a threat to global security. Like, it's just crazy.
And didn't she also say like, we have to save the elephants, so we need to, yeah, she also mentioned the elephants. She's the one who pushed that.
It's always the elephants. It's always, you know, because it's a simple narrative. They buy these ideas, and like the propaganda machine over the years, when you look at like The Lion King, Dumbo, all of these Disney movies that give us this attachment towards the wildlife, all of a sudden, you know, and then you watch on TV Diane Goodall or Diane Fossey, you know, I mean, not, is it Diane Goodall? Jane Goodall.
Jane Goodall and Diane, yeah.
Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, you know, cuddling the chimps or the gorillas. And you're like, you know, all of these things play in your mind, in the American mind, and it gives them this sense of urgency to want to protect. They don't question the methods of conservation. They never question it. Even Africans, most Africans don't, at least not enough. The few of us that have really come out to denounce it, you know, even in academia, you have Mordecai now, that's his voice is finally starting to be heard, right? I'm hoping to also be that kind of voice, right? To really snap, like, y'all need to snap out of it. This is not what you think. And so going back to what I was saying earlier is that what worries me so much, Sarah, is that they don't publish or report the conservation related killings, okay, or even arrests. They're not obligated. There's no law that says that the government, you know, the ministry, even if you try, I tried to get it one time in Senegal at my site where I work for my dissertation research. I try to get the report on how many people they've arrested, fishermen they have arrested at Juge National Park. Nobody wanted to answer that. You know, I literally had to go through the archive, dust off some old books. They don't report it, to try to find it, manually count it, how many people. And even there, they had fatal shootings too in Senegal recently, killing 2 or 3 fishermen, you know, a year before I got there for my research, right? And it's happening there too, but nobody is reporting it. And so people starting only paying attention, you know, we really was able to grasp the scale of killings, right? Especially with African men, because those are they're the one who are going hunting, you know, traditionally hunting or subsistence hunting. Women are mostly gatherers, right? They only go, you know, so And they're not necessarily seen as a threat for a lot of park rangers. They'll apprehend them and tell them out. But every time it's an African man that is going in for subsistence hunting, and it's just the image that they have in their head, like the defenses start going up, the red alarms start going. And so, we've only been able to really grasp the scale of the killings in this so-called war on poaching. When in 2015, the president of Mozambique accused Kruger National Park, which is a transboundary park between in the Limpopo region in South Africa and Mozambique. He reported that 500 young Mozambican men were killed by the anti-poaching unit at Kruger, and that's in a matter of 3 years, right? From 2012 to 2015. And the only reason why he even denounced it was because of the sheer number of killings that were happening over and over again. But that is just in Mozambique. We know that these killings are happening, but they're not reporting it. Like I told you, I tried to get a report of statistic. I could not even get that, right? And so it's as if these people, these African men that are going for subsistence hunting are just disposable, like, well, most Africans anyway, like that's how we collectively view these, subsistence hunters.
But these shoot to kill policies make it even easier, right?
Oh yeah, like it makes it easier, but it's also making them be able to do it without having to even go through the criminal, injustice process, right? I'm not defending that, even the criminal justice system or injustice system, or I'm not talking about accountability here. They need to be held accountable. It just should not be happening, period. Because a lot of these subsistence hunters, right? That are going in there, or even when they call them poachers, right? But the vast majority, there's a report that came out from the Kenyan Wildlife Department, I think, and don't quote me on it. I'll need to go back and pull out that report to see where it came from. But I know it was one of the wildlife ministry, out of the wildlife ministry in Kenya, that reported they did a study and found that over half, the vast majority of poaching related arrests are for subsistence hunting. In other words, these people were actually going in there, they're poaching for food. They're not poaching to kill your elephant, they're not poaching to kill your rhino, they're going in to eat, right? To find game meat, or what they call them bush meat. And that's how they characterize it. That's how they even call it in like the literature. They call conservation literature or language call these types of meat bush meat, right? So they're going in there, and that's over half of, the vast majority of poaching related arrests are over game meat. They're over meat, small to medium sized game. So they're not even, so the evidence is even pointing that these arrests, they're not even to protect your precious elephant. These are people who are looking for food, and then game meat or bush meat, and I hate to use that term, right? But, these are the type of meat, it's vital for the food security of rural communities, communities in Africa that are too far from the city, right? These isolated communities, this is, for most of them, it's almost their sole source of protein because they can't afford anything else, any form of protein. And so this war on wildlife has completely devastated not just their relationship with wildlife, right? Their hunting tradition, subsistence hunting tradition, but even their food systems. And people don't necessarily think about it that way, but it is, because you're severing for a lot of them, their only source of protein. And that was something that came coming back up over and over again, even when I was doing my research in Senegal, that they're going in there to find them some food, you know, not just income, but these are, you know, for their own subsistence as well. So this is what they do, right? They remove Africans from their lands. They tell them you can't fish, you can't hunt, you can't farm on these lands. You can go in sometimes and have your spiritual practice, because a lot of them too have a spiritual connection. That's where their ancestors were buried. So they will allow them from time to time to go back for spiritual practice, right? But then, and then they tell them in, you know, well, you know what, once they realize that their Africans are very disgruntled by, you know, disgruntled, that's it, right? By having been completely pushed off their land, they're coming back and say the liberals, the good environmentalists or the good conservationists will go in. That's white conservation goes in and say, well, wait a minute, these poor Africans, I think maybe if we give them some source of income, or if they can economically benefit from conservation, then, you know, they should be fine. They'll have more incentive to not be disgruntled or to not be unhappy about conservation or to just even protect wildlife. And then so they say, so the IUCN, all of the, you know, IUCN, WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, African Wildlife Society, all of these big major NGOs, conservation NGOs are saying, oh, brilliant, you know, we'll just give them tourism, ecotourism, that way they'll leave us alone, you know, and we can keep protecting elephant, right? And so what they've done is that, and tourism had always existed, right? I mean, not always, but actually the establishment of these protected areas, these national parks, and, you know, was actually in congruence or in conjunction with the development of ecotourism or wildlife tourism, right? So they grew together one on one. It's just that what happened in the 1980s with the advent of like community-based conservation, then what they started doing is, instead of having private companies take on all of the benefits from tourism, they've partnered with local communities to open like community lodges or community camps, right? Or community-based tourism, which is a lot of my work are in community-based tourism, to be able to channel some of that economic benefit from tourism to local communities, thinking that should be enough for them, right? They should be happy. First of all, these communities will tell you the number of people in those communities that actually do support tourism are very few. They're the local elites, right? Who actually don't even like fish or hunt, or, you know, the people in those communities that are benefiting from tourism are the local elites. That's it. Everyone else say, no, they've never signed up to want tourism. It was just another model, just like protected areas, that was imposed on them again, right? A second form of imposition. And so there's still this, you know, a very extremely unhappy about conservation there. And so, but even with tourism, for example, like we've seen it, a lot of my work shows that it's actually, you know, tourism within community-based conservation are always propped up in a way, and there's different mechanism, right, to even look at it, that these private companies are using legal channels to actually co-opt community-based tourism, right? So that to put more money into their pocket, but even use the image of community-based tourism to get a buy-in first from the community, but then, you know, turn out they're not as, you know, they're very savvy now. They understand, they know what's up, right? And also sort of bring in more conscientious tourists from you know, America or Europe, thinking that if they're going to do community, you know, it was basically growing their niche market for these these tourists who are actually wanting to do whatever they call it, responsible tourism is how they call it. So they actually saw that as a niche, and they capitalized on the community part of community-based tourism, or they also call it indigenous tourism as well, right? And so even through tourism, you always have the co-option of this model, right? And this is why I say through and through, like all of these studies that come out and try to look at the impacts of community-based tourism, or like indigenous tourism, or conservancies on like local communities. And I'm like, they talk about racial inequalities in some of like in Namibia, South Africa, or they talk about, you know, inequalities in other parts of Senegal, you know, of West Africa when they look at community-based tourism. And I'm like, y'all, you guys are talking about the wrong thing, right? You're always framing this as you know, in unequal distribution of tourism benefits. It's like, don't even, we're so done with that. It's been like this for 4
And that's
decades.
the point, right? To obscure the root of,
exactly.
You know,
I mean, Sarah, if you look at the legal, I was trying to read the legal documents, like look at for their management plan for the community-based tourism in Senegal at the park I was working at. I mean, it's so obfuscating, right? Like the terms they're using, the communities don't even understand, you know, what channels they can utilize to basically claim their rights. You know, it's like, and so to hide, like you said, to obscure these mechanisms that they go through to be able to co-opt the agenda, right? And what I say over is like, people always talk about we need to center the debate on inequalities. I'm like, we're so done with talking about inequalities. Like we've been talking about this for how long? We are done. The communities have been very clear. Unless you're not centering this debate, if we must even have a debate, right? Because I still can't really accept the reality that we're still debating with colonizers over issues of our land, right? But if there must be a debate, it should not be less, you know, it should always be around property rights, communal land rights, communal land restitution. That's it, like nothing less, right? Because even when they talk about concession right, do you know what a concession right is? You're giving this entity the right, not of the entire land or whatnot, but the right to operate an activity or carry an activity within this land, right? You're basically commodifying parts of the land. Right? You can have concession rights over mining. You can have concession rights over water use. You can have concession rights over tourism, for example. So there are even concession rights over hunting. So what they've done with community-based community-based conservation is they've sort of built on the concept of concession rights and said, well, we're not going to give you this land back. Imagine, we're not giving you this land back, but we're going to give you the concession rights. We're going to give you concession right over hunting, right? Hunting rights. That way you can sell your concession rights to, for example, trophy hunters. And then whatever trophy hunters, you know, whatever they're paying, they can pay to hunt on your ground, and then they'll pay you directly, right? Or we'll give you concession rights over tourism. That way you can operate your own tourism, whatever, your own tourism business, and all the money goes to you. But concession rights always translate to breadcrumbs over time. It never, like nothing, and then people are always like, well, you know, we've done everything we could. Now we've seen that community-based conservation or community-based tourism hasn't really worked. We transfer with decentralized management authority. It doesn't work. So let's just take the protected areas back and then just have the government manage it with their Western, donors all the time. It always happens. Like, no, don't jump. What I'm trying to say is that people are jumping on this failure of community-based conservation to further justify the fact that African communities cannot, or give us evidence that they can manage their land, because we tried to do it once, it hasn't worked. Let's just go back to this old way, right, of fortress conservation. It's like, no, because you guys have never given them what they've asked for in the first place. And we're still continuing to debate colonizers. Like, why are we even debating them? Just why? We just want the land back. That's it. That's what communities have been very clear from the beginning, that they want their land back. That's it. No concession right, nothing less but the restitution of land rights. Conservation NGOs are infested. Actually, they're not infested. They are the infection themselves, right? Because they're all full of Western capitalists, of financiers, hedge funds, right? Like, think about, for example, the Nature Conservancy. If you look at their board membership, you have executive from JP Morgan, is it JP Morgan? Yeah. Goldman and Sachs, the Blackstone Group. I mean, and that's like all of them across like big transnational conservation agencies, right? And so what they're using is, these are all hedge fund investors, and all of them, and they're using basically conservation and protected areas, right, to not only raise funds, but they're putting themselves into these risky investment. Look, I don't know what hedge funds does. I don't know the mechanism of it, but all I know, okay, is that they're extremely ferocious. They're very predatory, okay, and they have the power to basically constrict and asphyxiate Africans, okay, to the point where they lose their land. They're going to lose their land over it. They're going to tell them, this is the best way to protect your land. Capitalism is going to solve it. They even have what they call the Capitals Coalition for Nature, Capitals Coalition for Biodiversity. These like terms that they're using, trying to shove down into our throat that.
And they have plans, right, to further this.
I don't even, yeah, and they have plans. Yeah. They do. I mean, I'm sure they do. Are they transparent about their plans? Probably not, but history tells us, right? We can tell what they're about to do. JP Morgan, Goldman and Sachs have already, initiated some of the most horrific land grabs in Africa. Okay, and that's for agribusinesses, right? Now they're jumping into this like biodiversity and development nexus, right, to advance again their predatory agenda there. Two things that I have to call attention to people, to really get them to understand the scale of the problem, okay, is how expensive protected areas are. Like African Parks, for example, which is founded by a Dutch billionaire, is currently managing 14.1 million hectares of land in Africa. And they're militarizing it, the entire place, okay? 14.1 million hectares, that is, that's even more than what the US Forest Service is managing in the southeastern region of the United States. Right, one entity, a foreign entity, a Dutch billionaire that funded a conservation NGO. It's not an NGO. They're very much for profit, and that we have allowed them to manage 14.1 billion hectares of land in Africa. I mean, it's just like the sheer scale, and that's just African parks. Think about the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy, basically, for them to even act in Africa, one of their conditions is land acquisition. They need to acquire land in order to be present. And the governments are they're gaining access to this land. A lot of these conservation areas are located on top of biodiversity hotspots. These are biodiversity hotspots. These are areas that are rich in biodiversity. Do you know what else are located on biodiversity hotspots? Mineral deposits. A lot of that. You cannot tell. People are always like, oh, Aby, don't be ridiculous. Like, it's a conservation. They're actually, it's like they're oppose a few mineral exploration just to give that veneer of innocence, but they actually do. They allow mining exploration. It's happening right here in the United States. Mining exploration on public lands is not something uncommon that, you know, it's not far-fetched. It happens all the time. So these protected areas in Africa are on biodiversity hotspots. These places are in mineral deposits, right? Most of the mineral deposits are in biodiversity hotspots. And then over time, there's been a study that showed that for over 50, that did basically a profile of all of the wars, the conflict, armed conflicts in the world from 1950 to 2010. And they found that 80% of armed conflicts are on, happen on biodiversity hotspots. And so this should really sound the alarm for people, especially right now that there's a push right now to expand the number of protected areas by 30% by 2030, right? And that 66% of protected areas are already located in the global south. And that's going to, you know, to disproportionately dispossess African communities. It's very much a colonial project, and you know, we should not have any illusions about it. No illusions. Biodiversity conservation today is through and through imperial expansion. It's a colonial project. That's it for wealth accumulation. Conservation areas are really the new arena of imperialist, you know, spatial domination and wealth accumulation.